Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's a conversation with Kara Swisher, Silicon Valley's most feared journalist. I'm Diane Fenner for the New York City Bar Association. We're celebrating our 150th year working for social justice. And every month we present a different guest speaker. And you can find all of our programs listed on the City Bar Association's website, nycbar.org. Today, we're bringing you two journalists talking about the internet, social media, big tech, all of the social issues created by the digital revolution. Our guest speaker is Kara Swisher, writer and podcaster for the New York Times, editor at large at New York Media, co host of the Pivot podcast, author of two books, and the person that Newsweek has dubbed Silicon Valley's most feared journalist. We also are bringing you a noted journalist as your moderator. She is Adrianne Jeffries. She has significant ties to the Bar Association. Both of her parents are lawyers. And we've been able to recruit her. She's worked at the Markup, founding editor at The Outline, former editor of Motherboard, reporter for Verge, New York Observer, Virginian Pilot, New York Times, Businessweek, and the Netflix documentary series Broken. And I give you Adrianne Jeffries.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And Kara, thank you so much for being here.
Um,
So Diane introduced Kara as Silicon Valley's most feared journalist. This is her reputation. She's fierce, she's aggressive, and yet everyone likes her. You may not recognize her at first because she's usually wearing trademark aviator sunglasses,
here.
but I have followed, there they are. I've followed and looked up to Kara my whole career, and I'm excited for her to be here. I have questions. We're actually taking questions in Q&A, and we have some great questions already, some very specific questions, and I think people are really engaged with Kara's work. So I may have to toss out some of my questions and just go with these. But why don't we just start, Kara? So right now you're doing, I believe, a podcast with the New York Times, a podcast with Vox Media, and you have your column for the New York Times.
Yeah.
How did you end up here in this position?
Well, I started off as a thank you, Adrian. I'm a huge fan of yours also. And the so funny when people say feared. I don't think I'm feared at all, but whatever.
I think
People,
you are.
well, I guess, but they should be fearful for saying stupid things. That's really good. I just get them to say stupid things. That's not a it's there. Most of these companies have doing the thing as you've reported and everyone's reported have doing a lot of these things themselves. And so just pointing them out doesn't make you fearful. It makes you honest and doing your job essentially. But how did I get here? I started off as I wanted to, I think people know this, I wanted to be in the military and I wanted to probably be in military intelligence doing analysis. I was at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown when 109 years ago, and I couldn't go in the military because I was gay. And at the time, this was even pre Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I would have told, I would have asked. It was just kind of silly. But you really couldn't when I was that age, and so I didn't really want to lie and hide and stuff like that. So it was not really open to me. And we a lot of people at Foreign Service will go into the CIA, but I would have done analysis essentially. I would have done what I do as a reporter, sort of like uh, I was on Homeland and but not that kind of thing, that kind of job, which was analysis. So I went into journalism in college, and then I started working for the Washington Post when I was in college as a stringer. And then so I love the Washington Post. It was our hometown, my hometown. I was at Georgetown, a hometown newspaper essentially, and just it went from there. I went to Columbia and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into my whole career, but I started writing for newspapers, and so I was a beat reporter at the New York Times. Excuse me, at the Washington Post, and I covered all kinds of things. And eventually, I started covering AOL in the early internet, and I started covering the legislation that created the internet, with Al Gore and different things like that. And so I was sort of there at the dawn of the internet age and the dawn of all these digital, beyond computers, because there was already computers and there was already Microsoft and things like that. But this was the internet, which was a different and big leap for computing. And so I was there at the beginning, that's all, and as a beat reporter. And so I ended up meeting everybody in the area, and moved on to the Wall Street Journal because they had decided it was going to be something through Walt Mossberg, who was my longtime partner. And then it went off from there, and I did beat reporting, I did columns and things like that. And then a couple of years ago, Walt and I many years ago, we started All Things D because we were entrepreneurial, and then moved on to create Recode, another entrepreneurial new news organization, and then sold that to Vox and started figuring out what I wanted to do more. And I got interested about 7 years ago in podcasts, just the way I had been interested in the internet before other people, and blogs before other people did. And so I started doing those, just me and an intern. That was it, essentially. And so I started doing interviews that I'd already been doing. And that's how I got, the Times came to me and really wanted a premier interview show. And I had, there's not that many people who have done that. And it was just me, really. So I started by doing a column because I thought it was an interesting place because I didn't love their technology reporting in the column space. It was interesting because they're like, we want to improve our technology column, in our op-ed section. I go, you mean like have it at all or do it in a decent way? It wasn't really the job interview that they expected, because I sort of slag them during the job interview, but they hadn't had anybody. And I'm not an actual employee of the New York Times. But I write the column, and I also do the Sway podcast, which we launched last year. And then I had continued to do a podcast I was doing for Vox Media with Scott Galloway, and that's called Pivot. And that just discusses the issues of the day. It's a much more lively, discussion-oriented one. We bring in guests, but it's like a wrestling match, essentially. He and I tend to disagree on a lot of topics. So I do that. And then I do events and stuff for Vox right now, but we'll see. I have lots of ideas and stuff, and I'm working on some books.
I'm curious, since you started out covering AOL, and that was the big tech giant, internet giant at the time, how is it different covering the internet industry back then versus covering it now, and the types of companies that you find yourself covering and the types of problems that you see?
Well, it's interesting because there's not a new, I forget who it was. There's nothing new under the sun. It's an old saying. I think a lot of it, if you look at AOL and you look at the early internet, a lot of the ideas are very similar to what's happening now. It's just new iterations of them. Everyone's losing their minds over Clubhouse, but it's been around. The idea has been around. It's just an iteration of a new idea that has already happened, and a better version of it. And so, or Substack. Everyone's like Substack. I'm like WordPress, LiveJournal. You know what I mean? So I've been around the whole time. So when they come up with these new ideas, I'm sort of like, actually, what's interesting about this new version of it is it's a good way to monetize through subscription. Now, subscription isn't new, and so I think a lot of, if you go to companies like AOL and the very early internet companies, a lot of them had the kernels of the ideas of what was going to happen, and they just didn't have, certain things weren't in place. And so the difference in covering them is, when I originally started covering these people, they didn't have money. Jeff Bezos had no money, if you can believe that, or he was not rich and he had a couple of employees, or Larry and Sergey were in a garage, or Mark Andreessen was a college student, that kind of stuff. So I met them when they were beginning. Now they're incredibly wealthy. They're obscenely wealthy, almost in some cases, and powerful, and they run companies that have huge impact. And so, that has changed the equation for how they started. So watching people, it's sort of like watching Thomas Edison or watching the people who started car companies, Henry Ford. So it's different in that they're now extraordinarily powerful. And many of them have not progressed as human beings. And so that's the problem, is they have all this enormous power in their hands and still haven't figured out all the legal implications, the social implications, and everything else. And so it's kind of interesting to watch people who, on that journey that they've had, and the potentials of danger because of that, because of the enormous wealth and enormous power they've gained in a very small amount of time, even though it's maybe 30 years, 20 years, essentially.
So we're getting some good questions in the Q&A, and I think one of them is a good one to bring in now. To the attendees, you can send questions to Q&A, and I will ask them throughout the program. So one audience member asks, what are specific tactics and processes to rebuild trust in objective journalism, parentheses, and math and science, at a time when people seem to feel entitled to their own facts?
Here's the thing, I think about this a lot, because one of the things we talk about this sort of, we're in a post-fact society, I guess. We thought we were in a post-racial society. Actually, we're in a post-fact society. The fact of the matter is, people did not believe these things before. It's just that they articulate them now, or they have places to articulate them. And so one of the things, like, you don't think there were conspiracy theories before. There were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. They just didn't have a place of articulation and then amplification. You think people were highly educated about science and math? Many people across the country, they were not. You just didn't hear from them. And they didn't have a place to trade all kinds of different non-theories or opinions. And so I think what's happened is that it's not that this is not occurred. It's been able to be weaponized and amplified in ways using these tools that never were available before, or people just didn't get heard. Like you had a certain media ecosystem that was pretty much based on the East Coast, very much based in New York, very much based around a couple, like 24 white men, like of a certain age, kind of thing, of a certain class. And so now you have an ability for all kinds of people to bring their voices in. And so what's happening is you're hearing their voices when you couldn't before. And in the ability to hear their voices, it gets amplified even more. And so that is the difficulty of this, is that now we were sort of on a certain information diet before, and not everybody participated in it. They just ignored it pretty much. And now we're on this incredibly, just the way you think about obesity or nutrition, we're on a poor information diet, and everyone's getting, whether you can choose to eat apples and oranges, or you can choose to eat, Doritos and whatever crap that you want to shovel into your mouth. And so I think that's really what's happened, is that the availability of information and how quick it is to use it, combined with the addictive elements of all these devices, combined with the continued isolation of people in general, and the collapse of institutions like churches and community groups, and even the workplace, the things that used to hold people together in an analog fashion, everybody's getting from digital. And so I don't think it's something, I think it's humanity sort of brought to a new level using these tools. And so getting people back is going to be incredibly difficult, because one, because people can be siloed into their own things. The second is because this information is so well hidden and so well delivered that it can mimic actual news. I think the level of media literacy is so low in this country, at least in this country, that it's hard to know what you're hearing. And then people who are malevolent are able to manipulate these things really easily. And so it's no accident. You watch the sort of straight line and between what happened at the Capitol and the stuff that had come before it. It was a very straight line of people with a very poor information diet, having financial problems. There was a really interesting story about that. A lot of the people who attacked had really severe financial problems, who had been fed a lot of disinformation, and it resulted in a physical movement towards the Capitol to express that rage. Now, I have no sympathy for them, but you do have some empathy for the idea of how it happened that way and how people got there. Just the way you'd have empathy for people who have bad nutritional habits because of all kinds of reasons, or bad, not enough education because of all kinds of reasons, and where they end up can be kind of predicted. And so I'm not sure what we do. A couple things: media literacy, try to push more media literacy, start to put some regulations on these companies in terms of the liability they have towards what they're doing, just the way you would someone who peddles opiates or cigarettes or sugar or things like that, and make them start to pay the price of what happens when they allow their platforms to be used to traffic bad information, essentially.
That's a good segue to another question from an audience member. In what specific ways do you advocate a stronger governmental regulation and control of the internet?
depends on what control you're talking about, right? I think control around data and privacy is really important because there's two ways to hit these companies. One is to do it in a way that quashes innovation, which you don't want to do. Some of the proposals are really problematic in that regard. But there's a couple ways you can hit them. One is around data and privacy and the business plan of these companies, right? Start to aim at what their business plan is. And so when they're able to use data and take advantage of people's privacy without any kind of governmental intervention, that's a perfect place for government to intervene, right? To protect customers. They do it in all kinds of other industries, whether it's seatbelts, there's all kinds of ways that happens. And so that's a really great way to do it, because one of the problems we're going to have is there is no way that the government will ever become a speech police at all. It's the First Amendment. We have it. It says, it's very clear it's first. And so the government is never going to be someone that's going to be allowed, as in other countries, they certainly can. They don't have the First Amendment, but they do that. There's all kinds of things that these platforms can't do. And like in Germany, they can't have Nazi symbolism, etc. In this country, that's not going to happen. And so we have to sort of abandon that idea of the government as a speech police in any way, because it's not going to happen. But there are other ways: the use of data, the use of privacy, the antitrust implications, that there's not enough of these companies, so there's not enough voices to create an atmosphere where there's not just one or two companies in one sector. That's another way to do that. More competition, more ability for people to make choices, and then there's ways of creating just regular regulations in terms of how they conduct themselves and how they make decisions. Can be legislated. It just can't be around the speech elements of it. And then there's, just basically public shaming, media looking at it, citizens getting involved and objecting and making them be better corporate citizens. That's another pressure point. But I think the idea that suddenly the government's going to come in and figure this out, especially around the speech elements, is just never going to happen. And it shouldn't happen either.
I think it's interesting to see what kind of questions we're getting, and it's making me feel more vindicated in the section of questions that I had written for you about the tech lash. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So it feels like these big tech companies, specifically Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, or Google, and Facebook, are getting unprecedented scrutiny right now. And I've had friends ask me, like, why is this happening now? What happened? It's like a switch flipped, and all of a sudden these companies became targets. Why do you think that's happening now?
Trump, the impact of President Trump, former President Trump. I think that people have all kinds of theories on what was going on, but I think one of the things is we have a long history in this country of not trusting largeness, right? Whether it's telcos or oil companies or train companies or whatever. And so a couple of things, not just Trump, is wealth, the amount of wealth that's created. If you look at the top 5 companies in the world, if you remove Saudi Aramco, it's all tech companies. The top 10 rich people in the world, Warren Buffett doesn't even rate anymore. He's down low, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. So the top richest people in the world, and especially in the pandemic, they've gotten richer by the factor of an enormous amount of money, which is amazing how well they've done in the pandemic. So the enormous concentration of wealth and a concentration of power, which is something that whatever the industry is, we recognize in this country as being a problem, or have in the past. So that's one reason. The other thing is the obvious escalation of hate speech and misinformation during the Trump administration, and the uses of these platforms for nefarious things, nefarious means to promote lies, to cause doubt in the election and things like that, in plain sight. It's not even, they do a lot of things not in plain sight, but in plain sight. And so I think a lot of people began to put together this idea of the most powerful companies, uninhibited by any legal restrictions, pretty much, and the laws that are surrounding them are actually advantageous to them and protect them, combined with the Trump administration sort of abusing and gaming them, starting off with Alex Jones, starting off with all kinds of littler players, and then Trump is sort of the king of that. I think sort of combined, where people started to recognize that these companies had enormous, almost quasi-governmental power, and we're affecting the body politic. And so I think that's, and this idea that they become the public squares without any public accountability. And I think that's really where it all came together, that it was sort of the natural place where this would all come together. But it has to do with both wealth and influence and result. And I think the Capitol attack was the end results of all that.
So it's basically the 4 companies that are getting the most heat are the 4 most valuable companies and most valuable public companies, with one exception of a company that seems to have escaped this scrutiny pretty much altogether, which is Microsoft. And I wonder why you think that is.
Well, they've been through the paces, right? They certainly had that issue. It's interesting because I just did an interview with Brad Smith, who's the president of Microsoft, and he was the one that talked them down from the ledge of sort of continuing to fight with the government. They've got issues too, by the way. Microsoft's got all kinds. There's still issues around software and things like that. But I think they have learned to cooperate with governments because they had been through the antitrust ringer. Now, Microsoft was never broken up, by the way. Everyone was like, oh, they were a monopoly. I'm like, they never were broken up. And there were a lot of the stuff that was decided was pulled back on them. But what it did do is it slowed down the company from its incessant aggression, and it got the company to think more smarter about how to deal with government and how to subject itself to regulation in a way that's good for both Microsoft and the society. And so they also happen to be, most of their businesses are in areas that are actually competitive, like cloud. There's a lot of competition in the cloud space, and so they're not really in areas that don't have competition. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons. The other was that when you think about it, one of the things that I have a hard time with a lot of people doing all this is they use this term big tech, right? Big tech is bad. There's no such thing as big tech. There are big tech companies, and each of them has a particular problem. In Apple's case, it's less dire, I would say. The App Store is a problem. There's only 2 app stores, and really one for each, whatever brand you decide to pick, whatever world you decide to live in. And so there's all kinds of issues about their power over third-party developers and their ability to decide on any rules they want. That could be solved through all kinds of consent decrees, all kinds of agreements, all kinds of negotiations with third-party developers. Not the most difficult thing in the world to deal with Apple. Like, that requires a certain amount of sophisticated negotiation that would probably, and including self-regulation. Like, we're not going to charge 30%. We're going to be transparent. We're going to, there's all kinds of things they could do. And then you get to something like Google on the other end, which is now facing antitrust scrutiny from the federal government and from states. And their market share is in this one critically important area is so massive that it's really hard to deny that something has to happen here. Same thing with Facebook and them and online advertising. Those are more like, oh, there's got to be an antitrust solution here, or maybe a regulatory solution around digital advertising and privacy, data privacy. And so each of these companies faces a different problem. In Amazon, you have several different problems. You have employment problems, unionization, things like that. And then at the same, all those issues that are happening, you've got issues of selling, fraud on the marketplace. That's something you deal with through law, legal action and things like that. And then you have this marketplace problem where they own the marketplace and they sell on the marketplace. And so data leaks and Jeff Bezos talked about this in his testimony. And so you have that problem, someone owning the market and also selling on the market. And that's another problem that can be addressed all kinds of ways through the FTC or other agencies. And so, and then the last one is you have tax issues, like what should some of these companies be taxed in certain ways? That's another tool we can use to control them. And the last part is the government really investing in innovation and investing in innovation all across the country so that there will be competitors to these companies, and seeing not allowing them to buy things so they own the entire market or adjacent markets. And so nothing ever bubbles up to be their own, to be a size like that, and so to solidify their power in the place where they are. And so there's all kinds of tools. It's incredibly complex, and I think people tend to try to boil it down to let's get big tech, which is which one kind of thing.
It's interesting. You mentioned the unions, the unionization at Amazon. So both Amazon and Google workers have announced unions I wonder if that is a new point of pressure for these companies to make changes. We have public scrutiny, we have
Mhm.
government talking about regulation, but now we also have these workers doing some activism. And
Yeah,
I wonder, yeah, go ahead.
I don't, I think it's going to be very difficult. Like, first of all, these workers are different. They're not the same. It's not like you have workers who work in a, car manufacturing. They all do the same thing or have the same, or they're on the same level. Here you have contractors who make stuff in the kitchen, and you have very high level, highly, not high level, highly paid engineers. And so their interests are not aligned. Like, what is a Google worker precisely? What is a gig worker? And so that's going to be one of the big issues, is that these unions are not easily belonging in the same place, these people, and they don't have the same incentives. It's going to make it very difficult for unions. The other thing is they tend to try, I mean, they're obviously being super aggressive in trying to prevent it. That's another thing they're doing. And and one of the problems is we've created a whole new class of workers now that we have to, I think, in many ways, we have to really rethink what a worker is, right? And it's a discussion I've had with lots of politicians, is that we are kind of in this mindset of what an employee is from 30 years ago to what an employee is today, whether it's a gig worker who works for Uber, or a contract worker for Google, or someone who works in an Amazon warehouse. What is an employee anymore, and how should we be treating employees? Should there be a set of healthcare and other benefits and rights that go along with the worker, or should it be company by company? And I think the difficulty is that these companies are so complex in the kinds of workers they have, that it's going to be hard for traditional. And then what is a union? That's the other thing, is, I mean, the idea of a traditional union is not going to work here. And so how can you reform the union movement to be able to embrace a lot of these changes, and at the same time work with some of these companies in order to figure out what the role of the worker is in them? I think the whole what happened in California around Proposition 22 was problematic. It's just, there's no good answers to how to deal with this, and a lot of it lies with a national healthcare system that doesn't devastate people, a way to protect people. I mean, this pandemic, one of the things, I was talking to president of a big liberal arts college yesterday for one of my podcasts, and they were talking about COVID learnings, right? What do we learn from COVID? And you can get positive things out of it. And so in the worker space, for example, what is an essential worker? What rights do they have? How are they protected from a healthcare point of view? It's all been laid bare through this, through the pandemic. And one of the things that would be nice is to start to think of what is the union movement going forward with companies that aren't naturally unionized, right? They don't fit in the old sense of what a union is. And so I think the companies are in really good position, because they can push it back very easily, and the ability to organize is going to be much harder for the people in those unions, even if they follow them around and do all the stupid stuff they're doing. It's still, even if they didn't do that, it's going to be difficult to unionize these companies easily.
Definitely an uphill battle there. There have been a couple questions about a very current event. Curious if Kara is following the Clubhouse Privacy story, and if so, what is your take?
You're kidding. They're taking your privacy. We're surprised. That's all. I mean, honestly, are you surprised? It's the same people who made Facebook. The same. You think these are fresh new people. It's the same investors who are in all these companies, whether it's Uber or I wanted to do like a crosshatch of the investors in Clubhouse with all the other companies. They're all the same people. They're all with Mark Andreessen at the center, essentially. And here's the thing: none of these companies are here to help you. They're here to help themselves. They're here to help their whatever business scheme they happen to have. And I think one of the things that I like to focus in on is that, people are like, oh, we like Google Maps. We like the dating service. Yay, yay, we get to date. Yay, we get to shop online. You're all cheap dates to these companies. You give them all your information. You give them all your data. You give them all your activity. You pay for this stuff for some of it, and in other cases, you get very little in return. And so we tend to cheap dates them. They get all the valuable stuff and then sell it, and then they're the billionaires essentially, and they have all the information, and you get an app or you get a map, or you get a date, which is great. I don't begrudge anybody a date. But so with Clubhouse, it's the same thing. They're not going to, the privacy stuff is not built into these things. And when you go on these things, you have to understand that it's their room. They can do whatever they want in their room, unless it's explicit that they're not doing it. And so there's two elements of privacy there: is should the stuff on it be private, even though it's kind of a quasi public space? Maybe it should. And this whole journalist tech bro fight, and it's exhausting. I haven't engaged in it in any way, because it's just ridiculous, what's happening there. If they want to create their own private spaces, they can do that. It's fine. I don't look into people's bedrooms through their curtains either. Like, it doesn't, whatever they want to do in that regard. But the stuff they're collecting from you, from your phones and your contacts and things you say, they should be much more explicit about what they're doing in those things. But just like Facebook, just like all of them, they don't do it. And that's not their natural thing. And again, here's a piece of legislation. Why is everything opt-in? Why is everything opt-out in Silicon Valley versus opt-in? I mean, just a simple law that everything has to be like what Apple's doing right now with Facebook, this new thing. That's an existential threat to Facebook. It is. The idea.
Can you explain what the new thing that Apple is
doing? They're essentially requiring people, when they have an app, to explain what data they're taking and whether you have to opt into it rather than opt out of it. Right now, most apps, you like Clubhouse and others, you opt out of things. Even there, it's not clear that you can opt out of things. And so whatever data collection doing, whatever privacy things they're doing, you opt out of it, and nobody does. Like, nobody opts out of anything. And so what Apple is doing is, when you get, it hasn't been seen yet, what they're doing, but what they're doing is, when you have the Facebook app, it's going to say, do you know what Facebook is doing here? Let us tell you what they're doing. Would you like not to have that? Would you like us to block that? And most people might go, yes, I absolutely would. That would be great. And so it's really problematic for, and that's why Mark Zuckerberg's losing his ever loving mind on on quarterly calls, because this is at the heart. Collecting of data and information without a lot of friction is what they like to do. And so that's at the heart. And Apple doesn't care, because Apple doesn't rely on that. Doesn't have an advertising business to speak of. I mean, they used to a long time ago, but they just want to sell devices, and privacy is one of their brand attributes, right? And so they're like, sounds good to us. Like, we don't care. This is good. This looks good to us. And it's a bit of a, Tim Cook is always sort of sticking it to Mark Zuckerberg in lots of ways. But I do think that it'll be an interesting problem, because Apple has the ability to shut this stuff down really simply and use it as we're the phone that's going to keep all the shit from your stuff from going elsewhere. That's a really attractive thing for a lot of people. We're going to protect you, and we're going to let you know. And if you decide to do it, you're going to know what you're doing when you're doing it. We're going to force transparency on these companies. And so it's going to be an interesting fight. And now Facebook is trying to say that Apple has an antitrust issue around messaging and all kinds of stuff. So they're trying to latch on to other things that Apple has an issue with. Like having a music service and competing with Spotify, and having the App Store and this and that. So we'll see where it goes. I think it's, years ago, Mark Zuckerberg said Elizabeth Warren was his existential crisis. Actually, Apple is their existential crisis.
So you said earlier that you thought, of the big tech companies getting scrutiny right now, Apple's problems are more easily solved than the other three. Is that because of, how does that relate to this privacy priority that they have?
If you look at what they're saying and they're announcing, a lot of what Apple's doing is trying to front run this stuff. Like, they know what's coming, and they know they have an issue with their developers. And so, because it's run by adults, they're like, Brad Smith talked about the 7 stages of antitrust griefs that you're in. Eventually you get to the one where actually we're going to end up being the most valuable company in the world if we just stop fighting this. I think they're aware that they have their biggest issue right now is around third-party developers on the App Store, and the control and the competition of, say, Apple Music with Spotify, or if they go into something else, their competition of having the platform and also having businesses that are growing. Their software and services businesses are growing really profoundly. And so that's going to be the issue for them, is the dichotomy between running the platform and having other services that compete with people that are using their platform. I just think it's not something, first of all, they're not going to split the app store from the phone. That creates all kinds, a myriad of safety problems and everything else. And so I think they are willing, I suspect they are more willing than other companies to start to figure out rules of the road that can be monitored, that they will cooperate with, and they can do just fine by doing that. They don't need to, if there is very serious data and privacy rules, and Apple is doing a lot more transparency with apps, that hurts there's nothing Facebook can do about that, right? And Apple can certainly manage some of its problems. I'm not saying there's not other problems of all the manufacturing problems with stuff, the issues in China. There's all kinds of issues with Apple, but I think if I had to stack rank them, I think Google would be on the top, Facebook, Amazon, Apple.
In terms of how difficult it will be to regulate them.
Yes, exactly. And I think Apple is aware of it, is an older company, does understand that this is where the wind is blowing, and has positioned itself better, especially around issues about privacy and damage. That speech Tim gave to essentially accusing Facebook of doing the riot, like, if not for Facebook, these people wouldn't have been storming the Capitol, kind of thing. If you read that, it was pretty explicit, the links between, and he's not incorrect about the hate speech and where it leads. But that's not their business, so they can slag a business that does that. So
we have an audience question that I want to get to about Facebook's oversight board. I'm saying that so I don't forget it, because I want to ask a follow-up about that ranking you just mentioned. Why do you have Google first, then Facebook, then Amazon, then Apple?
Oh, for antitrust. I think it's very clear. I don't know, it's 90-some%. They have 90% of search. It's just the number. I mean, it's just the number. It's just pretty high. And so you just have to look at that and go, in traditional antitrust sense, that's really pretty much the thing. They'll argue that search is everywhere. Amazon has search, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of a tough, they're being very narrow about advantaging. Actually, Apple's involved in that case because of making them default search on the Apple platform, gives them enormous. I think Apple's going to do its own search service, so I think that'll be interesting. And so that they're being very narrow in its thing. I just think that's the one you're going to see move forward much quicker. I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers tell me that one is a very narrow and easier one to win in some cases than a broader case. I'm sorry, your question was about.
So next up would be, then there's Facebook.
Okay, sure. The oversight board. I called it the UN, but less effective. So that's how I feel about it. And I don't think the UN is effective. So, it's a solution. It's one of the solutions for them not taking responsibility for their business. It's an incredibly difficult, I acknowledge it's an incredibly difficult problem to try to figure out how to do this, but this seems like an artisanal solution. Where they're going to take up only so many things. It's like when I say 40 people making a decision, what does that sound like to you? Not a good solution.
A lengthy process.
A lengthy process. That's right. I think their businesses, they got to decide what they're going to do on the problem is, I don't know if there's any other solution. There isn't any other solution, right? Like, what is the solution? Well, Mark decides everything. That's one single person. The best solution is competition. So there's lots of platforms. That's the best solution, so that there's lots of people making lots of decisions and the best solution is Reddit is as big as Facebook, as big as, Snapchat, is as big as whatever. But
Reddit's pretty big.
It is pretty big. It's not as big as none of them. I mean, they all pale in comparison to Facebook and its impact. They just do. If you look at the numbers and the amount, they're big, but they're not big. They're little. They're little, actually. And the Reddit CEO who I just interviewed would say this. Twitter's little. Twitter has an outsized influence on journalists like you and I, and others, and politicians. But it's little. It's a little business. And if you look at the numbers, by every measure, it's little. So the question is, how do you really solve this problem that's almost unsolvable, right? It's an unsolvable situation. You can't have Mark making all the decisions. The board is too slow. you know, they could change their algorithms. They could decide that this is not the way they want to make money, that the way they can do it. And they did that before the election. They moved around their algorithms quite a bit, and everything calmed down rather quickly, right? They can decide they're a civic company as well as a profit-making company. They could decide that and make changes that way. I'm not sure there's a particularly good solution that I have been able to think of. Do you have one, Adrianne? I don't know. I don't have one.
I think competition is a good answer, and regulation around collection of data.
And liability in the worst cases. That's where I
Mhm.
really think has not been taken advantage of because of Section 230, which you and I talked about previously.
Well, let's talk
there's an
about it
element
again
of
with the
liability that
audience.
works really well here. There's,
Mhm.
you know, being sued really does clean you up a lot. Like if they had the idea that they were going to be sued, they make changes. This happened in Germany when Germans were going to put them in jail. So they criminally. I think in certain cases, the response, like what happened in Myanmar, what's their responsibility around what happened there? Like they're not able to be sued at all, and so there's no ability to figure out what they could possibly be sued for. There should be lawsuits around this Capitol attack, given how they organized and allowed, you know, sedition to go on the site. Like, what is the liability around that? But you never are going to go there because of Section 230, and so
So
that would
let's
be
zoom out just a little bit, and since we're talking to lawyers, but I'm not sure they know Section 230
so
necessarily. So can you just explain Section 230? It's the Communications Decency
it's
Act.
in the Communications, which most of which was declared unconstitutional, by the way, the Communications Decency Act. But this is a section of it called Section 230 that essentially gives broad immunity. I'm saying it in a stupid way, but it gives broad immunity. What happened at the beginning of the internet age, there was a couple of companies, one of which did a lot of monitoring, the other one didn't at all. And the one that did monitoring got into trouble because they were monitoring. And then on these platforms, people said libelous things and things like that. And so it was designed to allow these platforms, not third-party platforms, to be able to not be liable for things third parties did on their platforms. They were benign platforms. And it sort of treated them a little like the phone company, I guess, except they're not like the phone companies. And so one of the things that these companies call themselves is platagers, which they're platforms and publishers. So they're not media, but they're not benign like a phone company kind of thing. And so that's the difficulty. And so it was meant to protect them from being sued out of existence at the nascency of the internet age. Well, now they're the most powerful companies in the world, and they're totally protected from any liability on most things that have to do with it. And in some cases, that's a good thing. And in other cases, why can't they be sued for certain behaviors that they do? And that's I think where we are right now. And they're trying to figure out how to, you know, Donald Trump put an executive order, you know, essentially written by his kindergarten lawyer, whoever that was, that was just like, let's get rid of it. Like, you can't do that because it would put these businesses out of business in seconds. Like a lot of this stuff, you have to reform it. You have to figure out what the new rules of the road are going forward in terms of liability. And, you know, again, we act like we can't do something that's sophisticated and nuanced, and we certainly can. Like, what is the way forward to create a way to protect these platforms, but at the same time allow people justifiably to be able to sue them if they did things, you know, if they created an app that caused something and they didn't monitor it, just like you would a cigarette company or a tire. We can sue about tires. We can sue about brakes falling out. These apps are just, they're digital, but they're the same things. They're like versions of bad brakes. And so why not be able to at least target them in some way? And so that's what's being discussed right now, but we'll see.
Going back to antitrust, we have another question from our high information audience. I love it. Senator Klobuchar recently introduced a bill that would significantly expand antitrust enforcement authority to discourage large firms such as Facebook or Amazon from engaging in exclusionary conduct or acquiring nascent competitors. Do you see legislation of this type getting adopted this term? And if so, would it have a meaningful impact for high tech firms?
I'm not sure. I haven't studied it enough, but I have her book. I'm going to read it this weekend. She just wrote a book on it. It's called Antitrust from the Gilded Age. It's enormous. It's that big fat book back here. I'm going to interview her about it soon. So I can't, I have to say I haven't read everything she's written about it. I think, I don't know. I think possibly that they could start to pass some of this legislation. She's been in the forefront of a lot of this stuff. Like she had the Honest Ads Act, I think, and some others. she's really been at the forefront of a lot of these. And obviously she's a lawyer, and the question is, and I think the question is, where are we going to apply beyond what Senator Klobuchar is saying is, what is antitrust going forward? That's the idea. You know, I've talked to Lena Khan, who worked on the House subcommittee when they were doing some of those hearings. She's now, where did she just go? She just went somewhere big. She might be an FTC commissioner. Her name's being bandied about for that. And so the idea of what antitrust has to be reformed, I think, absolutely correctly. And that's one of the things that Senator Klobuchar, I believe, is discussing in this book, which I have not read, so I'm not going to say things I don't know. So I think passing this year, I don't know. Maybe not so much. I think they've got a lot of other things to do around COVID, around impeachment right now. There's a lot of other things. I don't think it's high on the list at this moment, but I do think there will be significant data privacy legislation passed within the next year or two. And this is a long time coming. Around antitrust and Section 230, it's a much more complex issue, so I think it's going to take longer, and it should take longer to do it. There is the window, this political window, of course. If we get another election where the House and Senate are at odds, you're going to have a problem. But I do think there is bipartisan feelings around this. If the Republicans can stop spinning their wheels on the conservative bias thing, which is just a feint by most of them, they could really get to something together, because it's really about power versus but bias. Bias has nothing to do with it. It's all about power of these companies. And if you solve the power problem, you solve the bias, any perceived bias problem. It doesn't exist, by the way. Study after study after study shows it. They just say it. It's like they just keep like election fraud. It's not true. But they keep saying bias. It's not true. It's actually not true. So we'll see. That's a long way of saying we'll see. I do think privacy and maybe some cyber defense stuff is going to pass first before that, because it's a lot easier than this complex topic.
We have a question on that as well, and I know you've written about this recently. Mm-hmm. Is our government prepared to face global cyber threats?
No, yes and no. I just did a really good interview with Brad Smith about this, and also Nicole Perlroth, who wrote a great book. If you want to, it's over there. I wish I could show it to you, but I have all the books. It's called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends." It's terrifying. Read it. I suggest, and listen to Nicole talk to me about it. Her feeling was that there was a lot of mistakes made many years ago in the U.S. About a number of things, including doing Stuxnet. Doing those attacks sort of opened up the Pandora's box of other countries using these. We were the first to start to really use them in an aggressive manner. And the other is creating a gray market for cyber weapons. So we're sort of responsible for the attacks that are on us right now. So her contention, and a contention of a lot of really smart people, is that we're really good on cyber attacks. We've been really quite out in the forefront of them. And we haven't been paying attention to the defense part of it. And the problem is that we have the most stuff to steal, and we have the most open networks, and so therefore we're an asset-rich target for a lot of these companies. And so most people are sort of worried that SolarWinds, for example, which is an espionage hack, that's what they feel it is, not a financial one, is just the beginning of a very large series of attacks on the U.S. There's ransomware attacks going on. There's attacks on infrastructure. And so she came to the conclusion there should be a single point of cyber defense in this country. A lot of people don't agree with that for lots of reasons, including spying on American citizens. But I think her point was they have the FBI looking at certain things because it's domestic. They have the NSA and other agencies looking at it. And then there's the Defense Department also involved in it, that there's too many points of contention, and all the information is siloed. And she compared it to 9/11. Where everybody had a piece of the information about what was going to happen, but they never brought them together. And she feels there should be I think I'm characterizing what she's written right, is that there needs to be a single point of cyber defense, and that we are lacking in the ability to understand what's the incursions, because they're coming in so many different ways and so many different flavors. I think you might blame the Trump administration here because they ignored it completely. I mean, 9 months not to understand there was a massive hack on so many parts of the US government and so many companies. And if not for FireEye saying it happened, because a lot of companies don't like to say when they've been attacked, if not for FireEye being explicit about what happened and then Microsoft followed, nobody would have known about this. So she has all kinds of things, but yes, we are really bad in cyber defense. We're very good in cyber attacks, but it's always easier to break than it is to protect, I guess, in everything in life.
So you mentioned this idea of conservative bias on the social media platforms not being a real thing. We have a couple questions about that.
All right.
One attendee asks, what about bringing back some version of the fairness doctrine? Oh, this is about reporting. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But so this question is about reporting.
I want to bring back the fairness doctrine. I think that's not going to happen. It's impossible in this. It's so massive. Like, how do you the amount you could monitor so many networks and so much broadcast very easily. This is non-monitorable. That's the problem, is that it's so massive. There's like, I forget what YouTube uploads every minute. Maybe Adrian, you know, but it's like some number that's so insane that and then there's the text, and then there's all the communications, and then I just think it's not. How do you monitor it? How do you figure out how to enforce it? And I think there's got to be a new. This is not our problem. This is, this idea of bias. Everybody has a voice. Everybody. The problem is there's too many voices is what's happening. And there's too many malevolent voices and voices intent on creating destruction and discord. And that's the problem. It's not the problem that people don't get to speak. I'm always sort of saying, it's so funny when you talk to some of these people who allege bias, when you get them off the record, they're like, oh, we don't believe it. It's just good for either fundraising, or it gets them mad and stuff like that. And, so much of it is, you look at the bot activity, one company can do both sides of the game and create anger. That's the whole game that they're playing. So I think there's not too many voices. There's not a problem of people's voices being quashed. I think that's really the opposite problem. They can scream all they want about it, but of course they're screaming. Ted Cruz is always screaming about Josh Hawley's my favorite. I have been banned. Like, he never shuts up. Like, he just got a new book. Like, get a new book contract. I said that. Go on the corner. You can yell. Get on Fox News. Go here. He has plenty of places to talk. He's not been tethered in any way.
So I didn't have the YouTube number of minutes uploaded off the top of my head, but I just looked it up. And in 2019, they said 500 hours every minute.
Every minute.
Another question about current events, and then I think we're getting to the end of our sweet time together. This attendee wants to know any opinion on the politically charged controversy related to Parler and their future. So Parler was the alternative social media app that got a lot of users by pitching itself as Twitter without the alleged conservative bias and with less moderation. Yeah, and Parler was shut down because they were hosted on Amazon, and Amazon decided they had violated the terms of service.
I know a lot about that because I did the interview that got him shut down. So what happened is I didn't do it. He did it. He said stupid things, and then Amazon was paying attention to what he was saying. The CEO, John Mates, came on the day of the attack on the Capitol. They had been sort of flying under the radar. People were using Parler. It was growing quite a lot and doing pretty well. People went over there because, a lot of conservatives got huffy on Twitter, like to say dirty words, and then they got thrown off, and then they got huffy about it and huffed off and this and that. So they went over to Parler, and then there's a lot of investment stuff going on too. There's a lot of people making some money over there. And the Rebecca Mercer was one of the funders, who is, known for funding all kinds of right-wing stuff. So I interviewed, so I called, I'd been trying to get the Parler CEO on my show for a while. And on the day of the Capitol attacks, my team immediately got him on the show, which was great. It was a great person to talk about, because a lot of the organization, by the way, most of the organization was on Facebook and other places, but Parler was an active place where a lot of people were organizing, along with MeWe and a bunch of other, Yellow or something. But anyway, there's another one. It's not Trello, because that's to do your projects. So anyway, so he came on the show, and I interviewed him about about what they were doing from a content moderation point of view, and dealing with seditious stuff that was on there and dangerous stuff. And he had very bad answers. All of them were bad, I think. And he didn't, he just, and he essentially said, I don't take any responsibility if they organize the attack on my platform. I don't, essentially said, I don't care. Fine. They can, they can organize it in my place, and I'm good with it. And if we don't get to it, so what? He had a real attitude that was, I was almost like, read the room, sir. There's people attacking the Capitol. You might want to have a little more concern about our body politic, but he didn't. And after that interview, I think I didn't do anything but give him, he said what he thought. He said what he was doing. He said what was happening. So after that interview published, people were highly emotional. And also he said so many stupid things all at once in one place. The tech companies really had no choice. They had already been engaged with Parler on these issues because they have certain rules of the road. And I think the interview just set it off what they already were concerned about, which was misbehavior of the platform, and they're on their platforms. And so they do have rules around apps and behaviors and all kinds of rules that they can pull at any time. And the question is enforcement. And so after that interview, I think they had no choice but to enforce, right? It was like, this guy is actively saying, I don't care if people are doing illegal things on my platform. And so they had no choice. So first thing was Amazon Apple and Google pulled them from the App Store. I think, and then Amazon acted, and then all kinds of Okta, all these different things acted. There's so many elements to an app. All their vendors pulled out. And that's not unlike, it happens all the time in the physical world. If someone does something, all the vendors pull out. And so they claimed antitrust with Amazon. Problem is, the cloud business is really competitive, and nobody wanted to take their business. Nobody wanted to be, whether it was Apple or Google or Amazon. Nobody wanted to be a facilitator for terrorists. That's really what it was. And so they came off, and he probably shouldn't have done the interview with me, but he told the truth he told his truth, and they just didn't like what he had to say. And again, it was already in the works, and he kind of pushed him over the edge, and that was that. So I don't know what to say. He wasn't running his platform the way they wanted to, and he shoved it in their face, and they knocked him off. That's really what happened. And they had every right to, by the way. They had every single right to. So, build your own platform, build your own app store. I don't know what to tell you.
Build your own cloud infrastructure.
Whatever, do it. They can. They're offline still, I think. They're still offline. They missed a real opportunity because everyone ran over to Signal and other places.
Well, this was a very enriching, enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Kara. Thank you to the very engaged participants. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I did put links to both of Kara's podcasts in the chat. I highly recommend them. And if you subscribe to them, you may hear Kara talk about the issue that you wanted answered that we didn't get to.
Yeah.
So thanks so much again, everyone. Kara, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm looking at these questions. These are fantastic questions, all the things. And I think what we're talking about is how do we conduct ourselves as society and behaviors. And the problem that we have is that a lot of our behaviors are now, the decision-making about these behaviors are in the hands of different people. Like two people made the decision about removing Donald Trump, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark then now tried to put it off onto the Facebook oversight board. But that's that. You may think they made a great decision, and I think they did. He broke their rules almost continually. He was like the biggest troller of all time, and he continually broke the rules and tried to force them into banning him. Essentially, that's what he was doing. And they made the right decision. But is it right for two people to make a decision? Why did it take? That's the issue we have. So we've got a problem that if they're making the right decisions, that's great. Do they always make the right decisions? And so we're sort of in a real pickle in terms of what we're going to do. And you mentioned Robert Kennedy here and his ridiculous, appalling anti-vax stuff. One service takes them off, the other doesn't. That's the situation we're in. That's where we are. Is that there are no people have alternatives to go to, and so Instagram removed his account, Facebook hasn't. Why the inconsistency? Just because, and it has an impact on our society. So we have to figure out how to do that. Well, you can do it through taxing, social media taxing, maybe just like we do with sugar or gas or things like that. But we have to really start to think about these things because we cannot have these one-offs happen over and over and over again. I think Donald Trump is an unusual case. I don't think there's going to be a lot more. There's not going to be 10. There's not going to be 50 decisions we have to make here of people like him. But the fact that it came down to 2 people, even if they made the right decision, is problematic going forward. So we have to think about what that means.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Kara. Again, you can find Kara all over Apple's podcast store, wherever you get your podcasts, and in the pages of the New York Times. Thanks, everyone, so much for doing this.
Bye.